Hi, everybody. I am thrilled today because I am interviewing a great storyteller, Nick Baskerville. Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. We are talking from opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Can you tell us where you are?
Yes, I'm in my basement.
Okay.
Oh, you probably want more detail. Sure,
Please.
sure. I live just outside of Washington D.C., so it's technically in Maryland, but it's like 5 minutes from the United States capital.
Right. Okay, great. And I am in Lisbon, Portugal currently after 5 years in Canada. We've been Facebook friends for a while, I think since the beginning of the pandemic, when people who had been doing true storytelling stuff locally wanted to connect to other people and do stuff online. And I'm very happy because this week you're going to be telling a story finally on my show, which I am co-producing with Veronica Antipolo. The show is called Ripple Effect True Storytelling Show. It is on Friday, June the 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so I usually tell storytellers, I usually read interviewees' bios before we start, but this time I want to do it a little differently. Could you give us a bit of background? Can you tell us your story with true storytelling?
Sure. So I slipped, tripped, and kind of fell into the whole art form of being a storyteller. I did 14 years in the military. I've got about 22 years in the fire service. So unlike a lot of storytellers, I don't have this artistic background where I'm kind of co-connected to it. I was teaching. So after about 10 years in the fire service, I began teaching other firefighters some of the basic courses because I loved just helping other people. And teaching is a way to make yourself useful. I don't want to be great, just useful, because if something's great and it gets less great, then people they don't want that anymore. But if someone's just useful, they're like, well, they're okay. They're not the best thing, but we'll keep them around just for the heck of it. So I started teaching to be useful, and I loved it, and I was having a great time. And then after a full day of teaching, one of the students said, "Hey, instructor, I don't understand it." And I was like, "Well, what don't you understand?" "All of it." And I taught for 8 hours. I know my stuff. How do you not know all of it? And so I went through my mind. I kind of thought about that, and I thought, well, maybe it's not him. Maybe it's me. Maybe there's a different way to kind of communicate things. And so I started looking for ways to understand how to communicate things better. That led me to a group called Toastmasters, international public speaking group. And so I went there and I learned some things and I got better. And then one of my mentors said, "Hey, have you heard of the moth?" And I was like, "I don't understand what an insect has to do with talking, but sure, I'll listen to you because you're my mentor."
Yeah.
And so around that same time that she introduced me to the moth live storytelling, where it is everyday people just stand on the stage and they have 5 minutes to tell you a story about a theme, and it has to be a story. And in the DC area, the show had just started there. I don't think there had been one there before, but it just started. And so I decided to see if these things I'd learned in Toastmasters translated into just storytelling. Like, how did it work? So I went to that. I went to a few because, of course, you put your name in a hat, but you don't always get called. So sometimes it
Right.
takes a few times. And so I finally get on stage and I tell a story. I didn't win. This is not an overnight success story. Trust me, it took probably like 10, 12 times before I won my first monthly one. And but when I got off stage, what I found is people were relating to my story. Like, they understood parts or they had their different take, but they kind of got it. And what I thought was, if I can stand on stage when people are half intoxicated and they can understand what I'm saying, then in the morning when people are fully caffeinated, surely they'll understand what I'm saying. So I started going to the moth every chance I could as a way of getting stories and anecdotes ready to be able to use in teaching and public speaking and everything else. Problem is the moth was the only thing I knew, and it was kind of iffy if you got up. So I started looking for more storytelling shows so I could be more consistent. I set a goal that once a month, every month, that I was going to tell a story on a stage,
Wow.
right? But if you don't get up on the month, like, where do you go? And so I started incorporated that in some of my teaching or public speaking, but then I also started finding other storytelling shows.
Hmm.
And so that's where the Storytelling on Purpose blog came from, me trying to keep up where all these shows were and then realizing there wasn't something already there like that. And of
Mm.
course, it started off locally because I figured that's all I could probably handle. Surely worldwide, I would never, as a person who has a full-time job and family, be able to keep up with the entire world.
Hmm.
And then the world shut down. And I was like, well, I guess I've got some extra time. Let's see what else. And so I only track the online stuff again as a way to just try to make it manageable for me, because I feel like if I
Hmm.
tried to track the in-person stuff and all the other places and countries, I just wouldn't be able to keep up. And
Right.
so that's what I do. I do that. I'm a part of the Armed Services Arts Partnership, ASAP. So here in the U.S., it's a group, nonprofit group that helps military members or military connected members learn performing arts. So storytelling, comedy, acting, poetry, writing, all these things.
Yeah.
Through there, I took comedy,
Okay.
the comedy boot camp. Again, not so much with the idea that I'm going to be a famous comedian, although, if someone from Netflix or HBO are listening, I'm not turning you down. I'm not just call me. But what I understand is, from a remembrance and memory and knowledge retention standpoint, right? There's certain things you can do with humor to help make things more memorable for people. And
Hmm.
so with that, I put the two, storytelling and comedy and public speaking, together. And that's what I do. I do all that stuff, sometimes just on its own or sometimes all together.
Wonderful. And I think it's so interesting that you were saying that you teach or you taught
Mhm.
when you decided that maybe you needed some tools for your students to understand better. Because I find that on your blog, Storytelling on Purpose, so it's
Mhm.
stop365.blog.
Mhm.
You have this teacher style where, in a good way, in the best way, where we really feel like you're trying to bring us information about this art form in the most compelling way, and you're sharing your passion for it, on it, as well as bringing us resources on where to find shows, which is wonderful.
Mhm.
And also the fact that you mentioned that you had to choose between referencing all the shows that are online or in person also goes to show how big the movement has grown, right?
Right. Yes. 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 Yes.
And you've hosted shows, right?
Mhm.
And you've produced shows. Um, how is that experience for you to work with other storytellers?
So yeah, so I've definitely helped host. The producing part has been more me helping someone who's already doing that. I know my lane. Like, I've seen how the sausage is made, as we say, and I don't like that. I don't like the producing shows. So
Okay.
I will come help people with their show in a
Mm,
heartbeat. Um,
mm,
I love it. One of the cool things about the pandemic, and I know there's been a lot of bad things for sure, but I have discovered different genres of storytelling.
mm,
So I do personal narrative. That's mostly where I stay. But then, because of finding other groups and trying to learn more, you find out about folk tales and fairy tales, and you find
right.
out about spiritual tales. And there's I just did a show at the International Arts and Ideas Festival in Connecticut, and there was a woman there from Japan who told this fabulous Japanese folk tale about being miserly and everything else. And so what I like about being a host is you get to meet all these people that you might not have met any other way. Like, I wouldn't know to go find these people, but here they are on the show, and I get to talk to them and then talk about the similarities and the differences and appreciating all that. So I always love just meeting groups of people, particularly who are doing an art form I am, but they're using it differently. they're doing different things with it, because I think that's where innovation and understanding and just coolness happens.
Mm-hmm. And so for people who are not so familiar with Toastmasters, which is where you began maybe before storytelling, what's the difference? How does each one how can each one inform one another?
Sure. So Toastmasters, like I said, is about public speaking. It is simply about people being willing to stand up, whether it be on a stage or maybe just at your work, and be able to speak. And they go through the technique and the technical parts of public speaking. So it's not just for storytelling, just anything that you're doing with speaking. They talk about things about stage presence and walking around and the inflection in your voice and how to use a pause and all those sorts of things. What I try to do in my personal narrative storytelling is try to get a story that sounds more conversational. You know, Matthew Dix, he's won them off like a bunch of times. He's wrote a book called Storyworthy, something I recommend to people who are like pretty new to storytelling, because it's very easy and conversational to follow. But he talks about in his book how the story on stage is a cousin to the story you would tell at the dinner table. And so it's just and so with that in mind, you know, sometimes some of the structure that is with Toastmasters doesn't translate into what the storytelling audience would want, because they want that very natural sounding conversational sort of thing.
Right.
But I think Toastmasters does a very good job of, one, it's a great place to get practice. Most clubs meet like twice a month. You can be a part of multiple clubs. So there's always a place to practice. They have in there, people get trained to give feedback, right? Because as someone working on an art form, someone saying, that was nice. Well, I appreciate that you appreciate that, but if I want to improve it, I have to know what was nice. What did you understand or not? And so in Toastmasters, it provides that, and it's generally supportive. So they want people to succeed. I mean, they have contests and things like that, but they want people to be successful in the public speaking aspect of it. So I think Toastmasters, particularly if you're someone who is still working to hone or just need a place to practice speaking, it is a great place to include for storytellers.
Great. And so you mentioned Matthew Dick's book. If for also first timers, do you have like a couple of tricks or tips when it comes to sharing a personal story on stage?
Sure. And I posted this actually in one of my blog posts. It was actually me collecting it from other folks. But one thing that I think about is start with the end. So when you're thinking of the story, where are you at now? And when were you 180 degrees different? When were you the opposite? Somewhere in between there is a story of how you got there. And if you think of it that way, you have tons of stories. People think they don't have stories. You have so many stories. So I mean, that is, I think about that, because when you're telling your story, particularly when you're doing it with no notes, like The Moth with no notes, or many of the storytelling shows that I'm a part of is with no notes. So you're just talking there. So you have to keep straight in your mind, what is the next thing? If you remember the end that you're trying to get to, you can figure out the steps or the sequence of things as you got there. The other thing is just practice a lot. Just get up there and say it a lot, you know, so that you get used to, how does it sound? What does it sound like for me? What do people understand and not understand? And I think the last thing that I'll say is there's someone who needs to hear your story. No matter how, like, this thing only ever happened to me. Well, I would say that version of that thing only ever happened to you. But the experience, someone has something similar, and they may need to know how you got through as far as you did, so they can get a little bit further. So always tell your story.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And so we talked about storytelling on purpose, which we can see on the right of your screen. And on the left is stories, jokes, and talks with folks. Can you tell us about that endeavor?
Yes. So one of the things, particularly after I did the comedy, and so I'm also a comedian and I do comedian shows. And I also do this public speaking in general on various topics, sometimes in the fire service or advocating for things. So I wanted a space to where I could put all that stuff in. It made sense, right?
Mm.
So because up until then, like I would put my comedy shows on storytelling on purpose, but I felt like that's not on brand. If I have a site that's dedicated to storytelling, I really wanted this to have that focus there. Comedic storytelling, which is something that I do, works fine there. But sometimes my comedic shows they're just comedy and they're about various things. Or sometimes I do corporate events or private events or things like that. And so that's what I set up there for stories and jokes and talks with folks. It also lets me to do things like I want to set up one-on-one coaching or doing
Right.
workshops. So that's where all of that stuff goes. So that's why it's a separate platform. And then what I just started doing is that the stories and jokes and talks with folks, that's where I'm going to take a deeper look into the mechanics of what it has to do with storytelling or public speaking. So right now I'm starting every Wednesday. We're going to start off with Wednesday. We'll see how that goes. Like I'm taking a look at storytelling structure. You know, when I first learned storytelling, they were like, here's your structure. Here's how. I was like, that's great. And then I met someone else and said, here's your structure. And I was like, that looks different structure than the other one. And then what I figured out is like, I found like 24 different structures. Well, how do you know which one to use? And is there a better one? So I plan to, over the next few weeks, kind of talk about that. But that's a deeper dive into that. Maybe it's not for everybody who just wants to find a show, but that's what I plan to do at Storyteller.
Yeah, well, I think it's so interesting to have this sort of resources in terms of craft and going deep into that art. So that's pretty cool. And you know, because you've referenced on your blog and on Facebook all the different shows that are happening and that have been happening online and now a bit more in person and hybrid, both in the US and maybe in other places, I was wondering if you could paint us a picture of what that scene looks like, either geographically or different styles, I don't know, what can you tell us about this world?
It is so massive. It is. So there are these pockets of storytelling communities like all over the world. I mean, not just the US, but over the world. And they've been there for hundreds, maybe even more. It just the year actually has to be more, right? Because folk tales are from way, way back, right? They have the origin tales where they talk about different things from different cultures for like how the world came about and things happened. So these pockets are there. They have always existed. I think what's interesting and maybe a bigger cause because of the pandemic and more people went online is they're beginning to connect to each other. So now what you're finding is someone who does spiritual tales maybe in India is connecting with someone in Scotland who's connecting with someone in the Far East. And, you know, they're different, but they have a similar sort of thing. And so I think there's that. I think there's also, at least as my hope is that people from a younger generation are finding out something that is really cool, right? Most of the time, newer people, younger people who are coming into it, unless their grandparents are telling them old stories, they know personal narrative storytelling and that's it.
Right.
Right. But there's so much more that can be done and should be done. One interesting thing that I think about is, you know, so here in the US for sure, there's a big rise in people wanting to do storytelling in business. How do I tell my brand story and how I do all that? And I think that's useful, but what I think they also miss out is you could talk about Aesop's fables in one of your things that have to do with business to get a point across. Right? So there's different ways of combining it. So it'll be interesting to see what else people come up with. There's, I don't think it's new, but it's new to me. I think the storytelling is Pikachu or something like that, to where you're telling a story in 120 seconds. There's a picture playing while you're telling your story, and it changes every 20 seconds. Okay. So it's not new, and I'm probably just butchering how it is, but it was new to me like last year, but it was phenomenal. A friend of mine, they did the show. and it was so cool. So what's happening is like in the background, there's a slideshow going, a picture goes up, and they get to talk about that picture in 20 seconds. And at the end of 120 seconds, or maybe it's more, there's a whole complete story, a whole narrative arc, and what was there.
Nice.
So I think there's going to be more discoveries. I think there's going to be more discoveries. I think probably the biggest thing, at least to me, and the thing that I'm slowly trying to work on is help people navigate this space.
Yeah.
You know, I think people have questions or they want to know things, but they don't even know where to start to look for it, or that even other things exist. So I think probably the next best thing for storytelling worldwide is helping people navigate how to find stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I'll put your links in the notes down below. And because it's an unconventional interview, I am going to read your bio now, and then you are going to give us a small teaser about the story you're going to share on the show Ripple Effect on June 24th. Okay. So you tell stories, jokes, and talks to folks in person and online. You've performed stories at the Moth, the Story Collider, and more. In addition to telling stories, you host shows and tell jokes in public and private events regularly throughout the DC, MD, and VA. You currently have a one-person show on the National Storytelling Network. The show is called Once I Learned the History. And you can find out more about Nick, local storytelling shows, and storytelling in general on his blogs, Stories, Jokes, and Talks with Folks. I love saying that phrase. .com, and Storytelling on Purpose at www.stop365.blog. So those links are in the notes down below. So can you give us a bit of a teaser for your story that you're going to share on the show?
Absolutely. So I'm a military dependent, military brat, as we call it here in the US. My mom was in the military. And my mom helped me answer a question that I think everyone has to answer. What are you going to do when you graduate? I just didn't take any of her answers. So for me, I had to figure out, as I was nearing the end of high school, exactly what it is I was going to do with life, which at 17 seems like a really big question. So my story is going to explain how I got from being there at home with mom to figuring out exactly how I was going to take on the world.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait for people to hear it. Thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you for everything you do for the storytelling world. And it's so nice to connect finally. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Bye.